Hello Year 12. Hopefully this will be the last time we have to do this, but I'm just going to walk you through the annotations of chapter 20. This will mean that you are going into the summer holidays with just 7 chapters of Dracula to read when we return in September. If there has been any aspect of the novel that you have not read, so say for example you didn't read through chapter 17, that was some of the work that you didn't submit. Maybe chapter 16, it's not really good enough at A level to skim over that. What if the extract that comes up on the exam is that chapter? You're not going to be wanting to put yourself in the position where you have to make something up on the spot, where you don't have a solid foundation on which to build your personal interpretations. So please do over summer go through your novel. What's not annotated? Do something about it. It might be the case that I've got a video on the YouTube channel that you can utilise, or it might be that it's one of the many PowerPoint shows or PowerPoint presentations that I put on class charts, or it might just be that you have to do it independently, but you need to make sure you have read every single chapter up to chapter 20 of Dracula. So let's do chapter 20 now. Summaries on the front there. Harker investigates. He's kind of like a detective during this chapter. There are 12 boxes of earth which were taken to 2 houses in London, 9 to a suburban house, which causes a bit of concern because if it's in the suburbs, that means that people will see you as you're trying to break in, unlike Carfax, which is right on the outskirts of London, next to a gloomy asylum that they can break into at night. So this is a bit of an issue, especially for a Victorian gentleman who wants to be perceived in a certain way in polite society. We then move to Seward. So we've had Harker as our first homodiegetic narrator. The next one is Seward. Seward keeps a record of Renfield's unravelling behaviour. Despite no longer chomping down flies, Renfield maintains his ideology that consuming life in some fashion is what he aims to do. And then Seward, in the course of conversation, brings up this idea that when you eat a life, you also eat a soul. And this really upsets Renfield. He's clearly got some really heavily repressed scruples, some kind of morality, which Seward is just kind of like poking at, and therefore kind of revitalising within Renfield. At the end of the chapter, there is a scream in the night, and it's Renfield. And Seward finds him in his cell, lying on the floor, face down, in his own blood. We open with Jonathan Harker's homodiegetic narration. As I said in the introduction, he's very much playing the role of a detective. Why is this? Well, it's something that we have covered before. Jonathan Harker is emasculated at the beginning of this novel. This is a novel set in an androcentric / patriarchal society, and one of the most important narratives, therefore, is the re-establishment of Jonathan's dominance as a man. And so we're waiting for him to reassert that masculine dominance. And this is one of the ways that he's striving to do that, by finding out a body of information that's going to help them defeat Dracula. Not Gradula, Dracula. So we meet him here. He's tracked down Thomas Snelling, who's one of the individuals who's involved in moving the boxes of earth. The presentation of working class characters is something that I think is really interesting in Dracula. I think at some point, it would be an interesting thing for the exam paper to cover, but I'm not sure they will due to the fantasy kind of emphasis on the collection. However, it's something that if it comes up, we need to be able to talk about it. So here Thomas Nelling, a member of the working class, is depicted as not being in a condition to remember anything. This is a euphemistic method of saying that he was drunkard. Okay, euphemism is when we put something in a polite way, as opposed to dysphemism, when we put something in the opposite, like the most impolite fashion we can possibly manage to express ourselves in. We then have a description of his wife, who's described as a decent poor soul. So there's two adjectives used there. The first one implies her quality as a woman. The second one implies sympathy. So we can tell here from Jonathan Harker's perspective that he very much looks down on Thomas Snelling and therefore pities his wife for having to associate with him. So far there's an element of kind of condescension to Jonathan Harker's description of Thomas Snelling. We then found out that Thomas Snelling is merely an assistant to another man called Joseph Smollett, also an individual who we would define as a working class character, however, one that has perceivably some kind of education, as we're about to see. He's first seen in his shirt sleeves taking a late tea out of a saucer, and whilst at first he seems a little bit crude because that preposition phrase, out of a saucer, implies a level of impoliteness. If one is a functioning gentleman, one does not drink tea out of the saucer. We would, use the cup. So it does imply his kind of like lack of manners. However, this is a man who can write. He keeps this dog-eared notebook, which Jonathan Harker describes as wonderful, whether sarcastically or not, we don't know. And in it, there are hieroglyphical entries in thick, half-obliterated pencil. Now, we could interpret that noun phrase in numerous ways. The hieroglyphical entries might imply really, really poor writing, which would be probably about correct around this period of time when we're looking at, minimal admission to educational institutions for young women and men, unless they've gone to one of the workhouse schools, or it might be that this is an implication that he is writing in some kind of code that Harker can't understand. So you can read that in a couple of different ways. What we find through a discussion with Joseph Smollett, sip of the coffee, is that the boxes have been taken to two places around London, Mile End and Bermondsey. Those proper nouns are used to generate realism. They are real places in London. And what Harker learns from this is information about his diabolical scheme, that he is working in a very systematic manner. So those two noun phrases are particularly useful for analysis. Because the word systematic, the word scheme, both fit into this kind of semantic field of organisation and planning. And so we can see that it's important that the forces for good are equally systematic and schematic in their approach to the count, which is what they appear to be within this chapter. Stoker uses a combination of accent and dialect to depict the clear difference between Jonathan Harker and Joseph Smollett, because no matter how wonderful Joseph Smollett's notebook is or his hieroglyphical entries, he is differentiated from Harker, and we are meant to perceive Harker as a more intelligent person and perhaps to look down on these characters that we're seeing now. Just to pause a moment and to consider the difference between accent and dialect, you can see there the spelling of Ansem removes the H and the D, so that we can see the accent of Smollett and how he pronounces the word handsome. But we've also got phrases which are not used in kind of standard English, like there ain't a many such jobs. Well, a many is not a formal lexical choice, and therefore this is an example of dialect, as is ain't, which is elision, something that we only use in incredibly informal circumstances. So you can see that there's a clear differentiation between the characters. The working class characters in Stoker's novel Dracula are relatively often depicted as somewhat greedy. I'm not convinced that this is really plumbed within the novel, but we have to recognise the kind of social context of this book. Those of you who studied Christmas Carol at GCSE would understand that during the 19th century there was great oppression and poverty in cities like London for working class individuals. So the striving for money is not something to be critical of unless you're an incredibly cruel individual, because actually the desire for money is about life and death for some of these characters. However, Stoker doesn't really see it that way. He is distinctly snutty, I think, about these characters. And that goes into their depiction as they're essentially all alcoholic as well, as we saw in the previous slide. And we're now about to meet Sam Bloxham, who moved the boxes into a house at Purfleet. Sam is a rare one when he starts on the booze. This declarative is used by Smollett to indicate that Sam, just like Thomas Snelling on the previous slide, is also very much influenced by alcohol. Sam gets off main early, never mind the booze the night before. This second declarative that I've picked out here is to remind you that irrespective of how much drink these working class individuals will have taken, the likelihood is that they will be turning into work the next day, because if they don't, they would lose their place, especially as labourers. So you can see some of the social realism Stoker is trying to generate to kind of balance against the marvellous. Remember Rosemary Jackson's definition of fantasy novels, successful fantasy novels, is that they are a mixture of mimesis, realism, and marvellous fantasy. Harker returns and finds Mina a little too pale, crying, probably quite upset at being kept in the dark. We've already covered this when we were in lesson last week, but the promodifiers, little too pale, this is Jonathan Harker being unable to interpret Mina's physical change properly. There's a casual attitude to her appearance here which, you know, needs to be remedied. The verb crying is a distinct difference in Mina's characterization. She's previously been incredibly pragmatic and incredibly strong, so the transformation is there for Jonathan to see, but his perspective is far too ignorant to spot it. He thinks this is because she's been kept in the dark. And there is a double meaning for us to think about there. Applying dramatic irony, what do we know that he doesn't? It is the dark that is the problem. It's what's going on when she's alone in the dark. But he's interpreting it to mean it's a place of ignorance that is problematic. But, you know, he obviously doesn't think on it too much, because he immediately goes back to the job at hand. Before entirely dismissing Mina's change in presentation, he describes that she's become reticent on the subject. She's not spoken of the Count or his doings ever since we told her of our decision. What I would pick out there is the adjective reticent. She's reluctant. She doesn't want to talk about the Count. We can pick out that proper noun as well. And this tells us that Mina is being affected. We know that the Count kind of hypnotizes his victims, and there is a part of Mina now that is becoming quite fragmented. Is she going to be that combination of herself and her undead self? Well, she might be if things don't change soon. So there's a kind of fragmenting going on within Mina at present. Later we have another description of Mina. She's described as heavy and sleepy and pale. That polysynthetic list of adjectives compounds what we've previously read into descriptions of Mina, that she is undergoing transformation, she is being attacked in the night. And Harker, rather than properly asking her what seems to be the issue, he strategizes and thinks that it would be a good idea if she went back to her own home. You can see that's emphasized through alliteration, with her daily tasks to interest her. Oh my lord, the patriarchal yuckiness of that particular clause. Yeah, he's pointing out here that Mina's life would be improved if she could be in her house doing her laundry and her domestic chores. What we do here is we'd pick out the noun phrase daily tasks, and we talk about the representation of Mina as the angel of the house. But that angel of the house characterization kind of juxtaposes with her true state, which is that she's currently a victim. What he then does is he is going to find Sam Bloxham, who is at Potter's Court, which is a lodging house, which includes, a lodging house, Corcoran's Lodging House. I read a book during lockdown, multiple books, but one book in particular comes to mind here. Corcoran's Lodging House will be one of many lodging houses which are in place in London during the 19th century. These were places of abject poverty. These were homes where you could pay a small amount of money and be able to sleep for the night. These were houses which were used by homeless people on the days that they had money in comparison to the days that they didn't. If you were living in a lodging house as a woman, you were frequently labelled as a prostitute, even though you weren't. You know, these are places which are really sad. And I just wanted to point out there's a social history behind that compound noun lodging house that carries a lot more weight than perhaps it's given in this novel at this time. Harker has been told by Smollett to go to the lodging house and ask for the depite. That's what Smollett has written down. So he goes to the door and asks for the depite, but then he finds out that actually the person he should be looking for is the deputy. This again pronouncing to you the illiteracy of, common Londoners towards the fin de siècle and indeed throughout the 19th century. Because what's happened here is Smollett, a relatively intelligent man, has been unable to spell the word deputy. I don't really think this would be worthy of any note, but Harker continues to say, the phonetic spelling had again misled me. I think you might want to pick out that particular verb misled, because he feels hard done by the illiteracy of those people who have helped him for very little. Whereas, the phonetic spelling was accidental, it was unmeant, it was certainly not cynically utilised. So Harker feels like this has been something that has kind of thrown off his investigations for a time. When he goes to try and find Bloxham, he has to deal with a range of different other characters of the same class. We've got the surly gatekeeper and the surlier foreman here. This amplification from surly to surlier indicates to you, Harker's frustration with all of these obstacles that the working class characters are placing in front of him. However, we then find that those individuals are appeased with the coin of the realm. Again, quite a euphemistic way of saying that they will behave nice with you if you give them money. And this verb here, appeased, tells you if you are appeased, you feel calmer. You've been angry and now you are calmer. You are more likely to be malleable and to listen if you have been appeased by something. So this tells you that money is actually one of the things that's making them surly. Again, reflecting the kind of social situation of the 19th century. Bloxham eventually comes down. He says he had made 2 journeys between Carfax and a house in Piccadilly and had taken this house to the latter 9 great boxes. So this is exposition. It is information that we are getting. I think the crucial thing to pick out here is this proper noun here, Piccadilly. We're all familiar with it. Piccadilly is an incredibly busy part of London. It's problematic if he has taken boxes there, because how are we going to extract them in the middle of London? Bloxham goes on to describe the house in Piccadilly where the boxes were dropped off. There's nothing new here. It's a dusty old house, which is very much the kind of characteristic of all the places which Dracula has taken over. But what's interesting is that at the house at Purfleet, Dracula is actually there. An old fellow with a white moustache, one that thin you would think he wouldn't throw a shadder. And he's also described as the strongest chap I ever struck. So we've got that juxtaposition between the superlative strongest, but also with the adjective old, suggesting to you the impossibility of Dracula, the character. His fantastical quality is there because he is so powerful, and yet he is an old man visually. The latter half of that dialogue, one that thin you would think he couldn't throw a shadder, which is obviously shadow accent, causes a great effect on Harker. He responds with the exclamative, how this phrase thrilled through me. So we can see with that verb thrilled that he's kind of shivering when he says, one that thin you would think he couldn't throw a shadder. Well, what is he reminded of? This possibly reminds Harker of the time when he is shaving and Dracula is seen in the mirror without a reflection. So that fantastical recognition, that imagery really kind of plays to the trauma of Harker's recollections at Count Dracula. While he took up his end of boxes like there was a pound of tea, again this simile linking very much to the superlative used earlier, depicting Dracula as incredibly strong, able to lift up these incredibly heavy boxes with ease. Of course, the reference to tea plays into generating positive faith with the British readership, with whom tea was the drink du jour. Bloxham goes on to describe other deliveries that they have made. Just a couple more comments here with regards to his working class characterization. We've got the declarative or compound sentence, whatever you want to refer to it as. I don't remember the last time, but that was the beer. So what we're finding out here through this compound sentence is that Bloxham is a character who during the day will drink an awful lot of beer. I mean, you have to remember that during this period of time, Hogarth is sketching these, you know, amazing drawings of what life is like in London, and he posits that drinking beer is like a really healthy, good thing for the working classes, and it was something that was, you know, celebrated. And so it wasn't necessarily a bad thing for a worker to pop to the pub on their lunch hour. That was quite normal in the 19th century. Sadly, not today. We then have a description of the old gentleman giving the men shillings, and seeing as they got so much they wanted more. So these men who have been doing his labouring for him are given quite a bit of money, and as a result they ask for more because they know that Dracula has it. When we go back to school, I will share with you an essay which is written by a critic called Maud Ellman, but you might be able to find it online, in which she talks about Dracula being a kind of symbol for wealth and for greed. At one point, a little bit later in the novel, the men are going to stab him, and money is going to kind of like come out instead of blood. So you can see here he's got plenty of money, and what is he able to do with that? Anything he wants. Like, money is it opens doors, and it is opening doors here to things which are, you know, quite vile and disturbing. Obviously Bloxham is paid for this information. Harker refers to him as my friend because we can see here Bloxham has contributed to the desire for information, which they're going to use to defeat Dracula. Ergo, we've got that noun friend being used. Harker is attempting to be the Propian hero within this chapter. As soon as he's got that information, the first thing he does is get a cab. So, you know, horse and carriage. And he's already walking westward, heading towards Piccadilly. So we can see that he is very much the kind of active participant within the narrative now. When he arrives at the house, we can see it's encrusted with dust, the shutters were up, it's black with time. All of these descriptive phrases enable us to see this house, much like Count Dracula, is a kind of Gothic setting. However, the problem very much is that this is within a built-up area, and he needs to gain access to it somehow. If I could find the former owner, there might be some means discovered of gaining access to the house. So Jonathan Harker is attempting here to logically work out how he can get in. There's a description of the surroundings for this house. You can see that the mews were active.
The noun mews refers to the kind of streets which surround this particular house, and in the streets the reason why they're active is because there are people on the roads, and these are described as the grooms and helpers. We can interpret the noun helpers to perhaps be servants, and the noun grooms means that there are obviously people with carriages who are working in the streets. They might be driving cabs, or they might be looking after the horses of the people living in the other Piccadilly houses. So we can see there that it is going to be problematic for them to break into this particular house as it is so busy. However, one of the individuals who Harker speaks to gives him a name, Mitchell, Sons and Candy. This proper noun refers to the estate agents who have sold the house to Dracula. At this point, you can see again that Harker is really kind of aspiring to be that Propian hero. As soon as he's learned the address of Mitchell, Sons and Candy, the first thing he does is he goes to their office in Sackville Street. The verb learned obviously indicates his role as a detective within this particular chapter. When he gets to Mitchell, Sons and Candy, we've got a really snobby account of a man who works as an estate agent, and the snobbishness of this is informed by the gentleman who works there, just doing his job. So, we'll have a look at it in a second. Maybe this is where the widely believed and widely shared criticism of estate agents comes from. Maybe Stoker invented it. So the gentleman at Mitchell, Sons and Candy is described as suave in manner but uncommunicative in equal proportion. So you can see within this compound sentence that there's juxtaposition between his mannerisms but what he is doing, so what he is saying, if you like. So he's very polite, but he's also not going to say anything. And this is an issue, obviously, because the adjective uncommunicative is the opposite of what Harker needs. Harker needs communication, he needs information. One of the reasons why the estate agent is depicted as especially snobby is because we've got this embedded clause. Having once told me that the Piccadilly house, which throughout our interview he called a mansion, was sold, he considered yada yada yada. So the embedded clause there, which I've highlighted in blue, depicts to you that the estate agent has been trying to upsell the house, so referring to it as something bigger, something grander. Therefore, we see the estate agent as somebody who is aspirational. People who were of the professional class in the 19th century, and I think still in the 20th century, if I'm honest, frequently looked down on characters of a lower class who had aspirations to climb the social ladder. And that particular phrase, climbing the social ladder, is something that people, look down on. So there's certainly a snobbishness to this estate agent's aspiration to be somebody a bit better. The estate agent refuses to tell him who's bought the house, or who sold the house. Sorry, we know that the Count has bought the house, and he refuses to say it because that's, confidential information. That's his job. And Harker's response is incredibly snobby. This was manifestly a prig of the first water, and there was no use arguing with him. This declarative contains a dysphemism. That means a rude word, a rude way of saying something, prig. And here we can see that Harker really perceives this man as a lesser being, and therefore he communicates with him using that snobbishness. He describes himself as a professional man, and then he name drops. He uses the proper noun Lord Godalming instead of, his friend Arthur. So he's appealing to the aspirations of this man's character to get him to open up for him. This machination of Harker's works incredibly well. The estate agent says, he would be delighted to oblige his lordship, that epithet showing his, desire to mix with the upper classes. And then we've got the declarative. It would be a pleasure if we can so far deviate from our rules as to give the required information to his lordship. So we can see that he is, aspirational, and Harker very cleverly has manipulated him. When he gets home, Mina is looking tired and pale, but she made a gallant effort to be bright and cheerful. So you've got syntactic parallelism used there. Tired and pale is structured the same as bright and cheerful. And what we can see here is that Mina is being selfless. She is putting the experiences of the men before her own physical well-being, which again contributes to the characterization of her as the angel of the house. Talking about the Count and what's been going on, the very subject seems to have become repugnant to her. The adjective repugnant means disgusting. And indeed, what she does when she hears about what they've been doing, even just a little bit of it, like they're meeting to talk about what's been going on, she shudders. So the verb shudders tells you there's a physical reaction to considering what's going on with the Count. Again, manifestations of her transformation due to Dracula's attacks. And those manifest changes continue. We've got the verb clung here. That's not something we'd normally use for the character of Mina. Mina is incredibly self-motivated. She can look after herself. Here she is very much characterized as helpless, a victim, clinging to her husband. So that verb there again tells you how different she is. Van Helsing is really pleased to hear about Jonathan Harker's work. He describes them as on the track of the missing boxes. That colloquialism very much depicts them as kind of like hunters. If we're on the right track, we are kind of following the right path towards our aim. And that language is also mirrored in the verb hunt. They plan to hunt the wretch of his real death, so they want to properly kill off Dracula. At this point, the difficulty of the house in Piccadilly is brought up in conversation. It will be a mighty different thing to commit burglary in Piccadilly, and that noun burglary there contributes to some mimesis within the novel, as we are, for the first time acknowledging in recent chapters the legality of what they are doing. After this discussion, Jonathan Harker returns to bed and finds there Mina. Every time we see Mina, she's in blooming bed, isn't she? So she thinks even in her sleep, and then she is also described as too pale. I think the clause, she thinks even in her sleep, is interesting, as it means that her unconscious experience is something that's active, which links to the Gothic convention of dreamlike, sleep-like states and the ambiguity between those and reality, which is what kind of Mina is experiencing at the moment. We then move on to a different homodiegetic narrator. We have Dr. Seward here. He thinks that Renfield is changing his moods a lot. He wants to go and see him and speak to him. And when he comes across Renfield this time, he uses this metaphor. He was in the clouds and looked down on all the weaknesses and wants of us poor mortals. So this metaphor is used to describe Renfield as having a sudden elevation. He suddenly feels like he's above everybody else, and Seward wants to discover why that is. And I'm going to give you a spoiler here. It's because Renfield thinks that Dracula is going to turn him into a vampire and he will become, immortal. The presentation of Renfield in these pages is very much like the estate agent, actually, that we had a couple of pages ago. The simile is used. He smiles, as would have become the face of Malvolio. Now, Malvolio is a character in the Shakespearean play Twelfth Night, and Malvolio is a character who constantly presents himself as a snob, as somebody who is superior to everybody else. So that simile is backing up the previous inference that we had on the last slide. The conversation that then ensues is really interesting, as Renfield has an epiphany during the course of this chapter. Seward brings up this idea that lives and souls are things that are spent together. So if you consume someone's life, do you not also consume their soul? And obviously the noun soul has religious connotations. Having brought this up, Renfield says, oh no, I want no souls. Life is all I want. Those two simple sentences just here tell us that Renfield is abruptly rejecting the idea that he would want to take somebody's soul. So Renfield must have somewhere deep down in his repressed subconscious the notion that what he is doing, is wrong. He doesn't want to take someone's soul. He can see that that would be the wrong thing to do. Life is all right, he says. I have all I want. So there's a sense of confidence here within that last clause that I've circled there. The implication is he's made a deal with Dracula. To explain that position, he uses what we would term a biblical allusion, a reference to the Bible, a biblical allusion. He says he wants to be in the position which Enoch occupied spiritually. And thankfully, I'm not alone in not knowing who Enoch is. Seward doesn't know either. He asks Renfield who Enoch is, and Renfield points out that Enoch walked with God. So this clause here tells us what Renfield wants to do. He doesn't want to be a god, he just wants to walk with a god. So kind of like buddy up with Dracula, be the servant to Dracula's master. However, this repetition of the notion of souls is something that's really upsetting him. He says, I don't want any souls. Indeed. Here we've got something called Epizeuxis. Epizeuxis is where we repeat the same word directly after itself has already been uttered. And here the indeed sounds incredibly insistent, like he's arguing with himself almost. When you've got all you require and you know that you will never want, that is all. So again here, Renfield is suggesting that he has already bargained, he's already made the decision to be with Dracula. However, this conversation with Seward is going to prove a problem for Renfield's repressed morality. Seward goes away, but he returns later and almost kind of tortuously repeats this question. What about the souls? Have you been thinking about the souls? Is what's implied by this interrogative. And Renfield is still kind of working through that concept. He says, I don't want any souls, in a feeble, apologetic way. What is he feeling sorry for? Mina? Let's just think about that for a minute. And it's clearly something that's preying on him. He feels like this notion of him taking people's souls, that is something that he feels hunted by. He feels victimized by that idea. So it's really something that's impacting on him, and it will have consequences later in the novel. Seward will not give up. He uses the interrogative, how are we to get the life without getting the soul also? And that interrogative is pointing out to Renfield, you can't take somebody's life without also impacting on their soul. And Renfield does not want to hear this. He puts his fingers to his ears and shut his eyes. So what we've got here is some haptics, some kind of movement associated with touch, and this use of haptics connotes to us that Renfield is desperately trying to repress this idea because he has a moral problem with it, and his reaction is compared to a small boy. This simile here, as a small boy does, tells us that he does not want the responsibility of doing something so amoral. What Seward then goes on to do to further torture him with this idea of taking somebody's soul is he asks him to consider that all of the flies that he has eaten, their souls are constantly buzzing around him. And he says, I don't want their souls buzzing around me. So we can see that Seward is trying to push Renfield to kind of break him, to have this revelation or this epiphany that is coming. In the course of the dialogue, Renfield says, "What's the use of spiders? There isn't anything in them to eat," and then he breaks off. So we've got ellipsis here, okay? Ellipsis isn't always demarcated with a ... Any sentence that has missing words from it, even if there is no punctuation mark to denote it, utilizes ellipsis. And here we're missing the word drink. And Seward clearly notices this. This is the second time he suddenly stopped at the word drink. Why? Because now he is repressing this idea of drinking the blood. He's thinking about it, but he doesn't want to express it. Anyway, going on. Renfield then does something which is very similar to what Seward has previously done. So Seward, within his homodiegetic narration, has alluded to Malvolio, which is a character from Twelfth Night. And here, in his dialogue, Renfield now uses a simile in reference to Shakespeare too. Why do this? Well, my perspective is that what Stoker is trying to do is get you to perceive the impact of mental states during the 19th century. Renfield's mental state has been so heavily eroded. You have to remember he's been locked up in a room. He's been placed in a straitjacket. He's been limited in what he's allowed to do. He's been completely isolated. He's been spoken to like he's somebody who has barely 2 brain cells to rub together. And yet, somewhere deep down in his consciousness, there is a man who is incredibly learned, very intelligent. And we get to see this idea that any man can be brought down to the level of eating flies if they aren't careful. So there's a kind of like a terrifying tension that's wrought by these little sudden similarities between the great John Seward and poor lonely Renfield without a first name. The conversation about the cost of taking a life, the cost of therefore taking a soul, is something that really upsets Renfield. You can see that within this rhetorical question where he uses the verb plague. This implies to us that he feels like he's constantly being kind of impacted by this idea. It's something that's gone through him like a disease. He says, "Haven't I got enough to worry and pain and distract me already without thinking of souls?" You can see here this list is polysynthetic, which really compounds this idea of all of these qualities kind of being weighted on top of him. Worry, and on top of that pain, and on top of that distraction. He then says something quite mysterious or enigmatical. "If you only knew the problem I have to face and that I am working out, you would pity and tolerate and pardon me." This is interesting. What is the problem he has to face? Well, we can make a guess. Renfield might have to allow Dracula to access the house to hurt Mina in order for him to gain access to Dracula's immortality. So perhaps this is the moral problem, but the fact he's even referring to it by this noun problem tells you that Renfield is going through a moral quandary. At the end of the encounter, Seward makes a judgment that I've already indicated to you. In the declarative, he has assurance of some kind that he will acquire some higher life. And then a little bit, the count has been to him. So we can see that Seward is able to deduct what I've already referred to. And Seward is such a useful homodiegetic narrator because he has that scientific tone and empirical tone.
that means that he generates mimesis. If he believes in something, if he's worked something out, we're more likely to believe it than Jonathan Harker, who, you know, let's remind ourselves, had a, quote, brain fever, end quote. Whereas Seward has had no such problem, although he was eating opium a little bit earlier, wasn't he? So there's the adverb logically that tells you, you know, that he has worked this out through his kind of scientific deductions. Okay, move on, next slide. The next entry into chapter 20 is a letter, so we're really fulfilling the epistolary novel because we've got an epistle here, a letter, which is from the estate agents to Lord Godalming about the house. And we find out here that it was sold to Mr. Archibald Winter Suffield, sold by Mr. Archibald Winter Suffield, and it was sold to a foreign nobleman, Count de Ville. So that noun phrase, foreign nobleman, is rather useful because it indicates to you both his otherness, because he is not British, but simultaneously his quality, because he is a nobleman. He is therefore a member of the aristocracy. We'll also find out one of the other things about Count Dracula, which is incredibly persuasive to individuals like Mitchell, Sons and Candy. He pays for the purchase money and notes over the counter. So we can see that rather than paying by a banker's cheque, Count Dracula is able to have enough money to buy an entire house through coins and notes. That tells you just how much, you know, money he represents. Going back to Maud Ellman's interpretation that the Count represents, you know, new capitalism that's emerging in the 19th century. So yeah, the reason why Dracula is so persuasive to lower and middle class individuals is, one, because he's aristocratic and therefore has power. He has influence. Just like Lord Godalming got this information from Mitchell, Sons and Candy, whereas Harker on his own couldn't have because he's not a member of the aristocracy. And also he's financially very rich and therefore influential via money too. The end of the chapter reverts back to the narration of Dr. Seward, where we have him speaking to the attendant who's been sitting outside Renfield's room. The attendant tells him that Renfield kept saying his prayers somewhat loudly, and that adverb loudly tells you something's going on. Why is he like shouting out his prayers? Why would he be praying right now? You know, let's make the inference that it has something to do with Dr. Seward's prior conversation with him during this chapter. At this stage, we find out the attendant has been dozing, so we don't actually know what else happened during that night beyond the very loud prayers that he was saying. Then we have some more information about, you know, the forces for good. So we have today Harker is out following up his clue. So we've got the proper noun Harker used alongside the noun clue, and these two lexical choices indicate to us that Harker is still investigating. He's still taking on the role of the detective. He's still seeking to assert himself following his own mental collapse. We then have information about what Art and Quincy are doing. They're looking for horses so that they can, you know, run around and get the information that they require. And then we have the information that they all have to sterilise the imported earth between sunrise and sunset, because that's the time when Dracula's at his weakest. So we can see within that declarative the importance of liminal time frames, sunrise and sunset, for Dracula's transformation, and also the time pressures which are exacting on our troupe of good characters. Van Helsing has gone to the British Museum. He is out searching, and I'll highlight this for you because I haven't already. He is out searching for witch and demon cures, which may be useful to us later. This particular verb, searching,
suggests, detective work again, something that's logical. However, this is really juxtaposed with what he's looking for, witch and demon cures, which suggests that there's something quite superstitious to his actions. This is why afterwards Seward says, "I sometimes think we must all be mad, and that we shall wake to sanity in strait waistcoats," pointing out the terribly thin line between madness and sanity. And I just want to remind you of the fact that many of the characters we have seen within this novel could be perceived as mad at different points. Van Helsing has a hysterical fit. Arthur has a complete breakdown and cries on Mina because he's just hacked off the head of his, beloved. We've got Seward, who at the start of the book was resorting to medication to get over the loss of Lucy as a potential partner in life. Jonathan Harker has suffered from brain fever. Mina has had to recuperate her husband from brain fever and right now is enduring hypnotic attacks by Dracula. Like, nobody in this book is easily falling into the camp of sane. Just something to bear in mind. Right, so the end of the chapter. Seward is still looking at the case of Renfield, and there is a wild yell. At this point, an attendant comes bursting into Seward's room, and they find Renfield, his face on the floor, all covered with blood. So we get from that imagery a sense that he has been attacked, and he wasn't expecting this, because Renfield, remember, was feeling very confident of his future. What could have happened in the interim? Well, we know that he was praying really loudly. We know that the attendant fell asleep. We know that he might have had some kind of moral epiphany because he's been thinking about souls. Could he have said to Dracula, "I'm not letting you in"? In which case, how would Dracula have reacted? Well, the chapter ends with violence, so I hope you can make your own inference. Have a lovely summer, everyone. Bye.